Let's get a word with Henry Hill, Deputy Editor at Conservative Home. Afternoon to you, Henry.
Good afternoon.
Nice to have you with us as ever. It's Kemi Badenoch under the spotlight here. Big speech yesterday, arguably our first big speech on a variety of issues since she became leader. This specific issue about integration I thought was rather interesting. Let's have a listen to what the leader of the Conservative Party said.
And no ifs, no buts. We simply cannot take all the millions of people who want to come here from elsewhere. Our country is our home. It is not a hotel. If people arriving don't want to integrate into British culture, they shouldn't be here.
There it is, strong words. She's allowed to say those words for obvious reasons, I guess. Henry, what do you make of that?
Well, there's sort of two problems with it. The first of which is, as you identified in your opening, is the sort of quite tricky question these days of what is British culture. I think I wrote a piece recently contrasting Britain and France. Now, France is often held up by people who claim that Britain is an integration triumph as the great counterexample, right? You know, they have the riots and everything else. But if you also think about it, France, you know, they have 5 tricolores on every town hall. They have a very serious, thick conception of what it is to be a Republican Frenchman, what the Republic stands for. And I think that when they struggle with integration, what they're doing is maybe trying harder than we are, because they have a serious conception of Frenchness with which people can fail to integrate. Whereas when you look at Britain, the best that most British politicians can come up with now is British values. And they're a nonsense. They're not bad values necessarily, but if you read them, they're basically just progressive values. And if we're honest, there's nothing on a list of British values that you would not expect of at least a progressive Frenchman or German or Kazakh or whatever, right? And the thing that is really difficult, I think, for sort of modern progressives is that an identity, it needs to not only provide common ground between everyone who is within it, but it needs to meaningfully distinguish people who are in it from people who aren't. And it's that exclusive, not xenophobic, but it's that sort of necessarily exclusive aspect of British character that we've largely got rid of. Because, you know, you're right, you mentioned church attendance. You know, even if you weren't religious, that was a ritual. It lent shape to Sundays, to life. And you mentioned all of the authors. The point of a canon, which has been dismissed as dead white men, is not necessarily that they are the best authors ever in the history of the planet. It's one, that they're authors produced by your civilization, your culture, your nation, and two, that if you teach a canon to everyone, it's a point of common ground. I could quote a poet, somebody I've never met before would recognize that poet. That's the utility of it, and we've demolished that. But the other one is about people coming here and not integrating. There is an alternative, right? If in the short term politicians believe that we need to have lots of immigration for economic purposes, we could just have what many other countries have, which is a non-integration track for immigration, where you can come here, there's no automatic route to permanent residency and citizenship, you work, and then you leave, right? Brits do that overseas. You talked about the Costa del Sol. Let's not pretend for a second that Brits are integrating into Spanish culture, the Costa del Sol. And that can be fine, right? If someone is just coming here to work, there's not necessarily a need for them to assimilate. But the problem is that our current immigration system, anyone who is here can probably stay for 5 years and then has an automatic pathway to staying forever. That's the problem.
I remember there was a Bangladeshi cab driver that used to drive me. I was doing a late shift elsewhere, and he used to always pick me up each night. We used to have a lot of conversations about this, and he always said, he was a heck of a nice guy, and he always used to say, look, the thing is with our community, and he was sort of East London, which I think is the biggest Bangladeshi community, certainly Tower Hamlets outside of Bangladesh, I think I'm right in saying. He said, we don't really integrate. He said, it's not, you know, it's just not there. We don't there's never been a need to. There's enough of us in one area. So it's not as if we feel like we're left out. It's just the way it is. He wasn't sort of suggesting it was good or bad. He was identifying literally how it has panned out. We don't really integrate. We do our own thing. We kind of look after ourselves. We don't bother anybody. This guy had about 3 jobs, by the way, Henry. This wasn't about a fella that was, you know, sponging off the welfare and all that kind of stuff. All of his family, I learnt a lot about him and, you know, the various areas that they work in. All of them diligent workers. All came over when they were about, well, his age came over when they were about 14. So his parents, you know, were didn't always speak the language, but the kids did, etc. And it was a difficult one for me, because it's interesting, because this is a group of people, based on what he said, I should add, in this one area, where he was saying, we don't integrate. And I thought, what does that really look like in reality, and does it affect me? I could say, well, that's a bit of a shame, because it would be quite nice if we integrated more, but how would that look? Am I meant to throw a party in Victoria Park and say, this is just for 50% Brits and 50% Bangladeshis, so we can do some integration on a Sunday afternoon? I don't know what the answer to that would be.
Well, I think the thing about this is, because it is important that we don't lump all communities together, and integration is a problem that affects, well, it manifests differently in different places. I think stuff like this was fine, or more fine, when the numbers were relatively small, right? Because it's not new. You used to have the very, very close-knit sort of Jewish communities in Victorian London. Chinatown is the result of a community moving somewhere, moving to one place, and then to an extent not integrating, right? That's what Chinatown is. But those were small. Right? They were small, close-knit communities that didn't really have a big impact on the warp and weft of national life.
Sure.
Whereas now, I think when you've got the numbers that have been coming in over the past couple of decades, it's different. Because all of a sudden, you don't have a small community, a few blocks where the shops are different and everything else. You suddenly have entire parliamentary constituencies that can be won by candidates who are basically fighting a proxy war over a conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's
right?
a good point.
You have a school, you have a headmaster in this country is still in hiding because he showed a class pictures of the Prophet Muhammad.
Great example.
And the police didn't deal with that properly.
No.
When those two boys scuffed a Quran, you had the abject sight of one of their mothers going to a Muslim community group and apologizing, and the police sitting next to her while she apologized to people to try and get them to call off death threats.
Yeah.
That's the challenge.
That's
right?
a good point.
That is a massive that is an integration challenge, and it does actually impact the futures of people in those communities as well. I think sometimes if you live in London, I've said this before, it's actually very easy to have a relatively rosy view of integration and immigration because, you know, most it's a very minority city, and most of them are not in these kind of enclaves, and you know they go to the same schools and have over time generations the same opportunities as everyone else. But if you're a child in a large community of people who have not integrated, you are in some senses a prisoner of that community, right? Yeah. You do not have the same opportunities to make the most of a life in Britain that other people do. And it means, as we've seen in Rotherham and less extremely elsewhere, that those communities can draw a veil around utterly unacceptable practices.
Good point. Good point. It's funny, I found myself watching a Rick Stein, the celebrity chef chap, program the other Saturday morning, I think it was. You know, when you stumble across something, you stick with it for a bit. And he was in France cooking, and he's obviously got lots of French colleagues who are chefs, and he knows the terrain, he knows the cuisine really well, and he was cooking for these people. And he said at the end of it, he said, I've been working on and off in France for decades. He said, the one thing I've realised about the French, and I thought, I wonder what he's going to say here. Is he going to say they love chicken or prawns or something? He said, the one thing I've discovered about the French, he said, they absolutely love being French. And you touched on that point right at the very beginning, Henry. And that is true. I think it's a very patriotic nation. And I wonder, you know, and I think once upon a time we were. Do you think we've lost that patriotism?
I think we have to an extent, and I think it's really disappointing the way that we now sort of pretend that actually being unenthusiastic about Britain is a British trait. You know, patriotism is un-British. Historically, that is complete nonsense, right? Like basically, all that's happened is that the academics that Orwell wrote about in the 1920s and 30s, you know, the English academic is the one group who would rather salute, you know, steal from a poor box than salute his flag, has kind of taken over. And also, we're a country where the economic settlement doesn't really work for people, so it's not surprising that lots of people are not particularly enthusiastic. Sure. You think about why were the Victorians so patriotic and enthusiastic, and that rolled over into the era around World War One.
Yep.
Well, partly because Britain's greatness was kind of evident, right? In the span of 100 years, we had built the railways, we had built our great cities, we had transformed living standards, all of that kind of stuff. It's quite easy to feel patriotic about a country that is working and making life better for people. Yeah. And in Britain, that hasn't been the case for some time, and so it's not surprising. And we do need to find it, because you can't. And I think the British politicians are going to discover this to their cost. Yeah. You can't really, in this country, move towards a kind of post-national or even arguably pre-national model where there isn't really a nation, right? There's just people who are taxpayers and recipients of benefits, because that works for an empire where there's no democratic oversight. But I think we're seeing with things like the distribution of social housing to people who many of whom aren't even citizens, whilst Britons languish on waiting lists. That kind of politics is going to get really toxic.
Yeah. Henry, stay with us. Henry Hill, Deputy Editor at Conservative Home, with us on the programme.